Eleanor Whitfield pressed her dead husband's ring against her lips and whispered a prayer she no longer believed in. 5 days. That's all she had before the bank took everything: her cabin, her land, her last reason to keep breathing. Then 3 knocks broke the silence of the ridge. She grabbed her father's revolver and opened the door. A tall cowboy stood in the scorching heat, holding a boy who couldn't stand. The child's lips were cracked, his eyes barely open. "Ma'am, please, he's all I got." She had nothing left, but she stepped aside. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel and stay until the very end. You won't believe where this journey takes Eleanor. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The boy weighed almost nothing. Eleanor felt that first. Not the heat pouring through the open door. Not the stranger's shadow filling her doorframe. The boy. Light as a bundled sheet, his head dropped against her shoulder the moment she took him, and his fingers curled around the collar of her dress like he'd been searching for something to hold on to for days. She carried him to the bed, the only bed in the cabin, and laid him down without a word. "Water," she said, not to the stranger, to herself. She moved to the bucket by the stove, ladled what was left into a tin cup, and brought it back. She tilted the boy's head and let the water touch his lips. He drank, slowly, his throat working like it hurt. The stranger hadn't moved from the doorway. Eleanor looked at him. Tall, sunburned so deep his skin had cracked along the cheekbones. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the eyes, dark, hollowed, watching his son with a kind of fear that doesn't make noise. "You gonna stand there, or are you gonna close that door?" she said. He stepped in, closed it, took off his hat. "Ma'am, Don't." She held up a hand. "Whatever you're about to say, it can wait until he's breathing steady." The stranger nodded. He stood by the wall, hat against his chest, and didn't speak again. Eleanor worked. She'd nursed enough sick animals and one dying husband to know what heat sickness looked like. She soaked a rag and pressed it against the boy's forehead. His skin burned under her fingers. She unbuttoned his collar, checked his pulse. Fast, but not gone. "How long since he had water?" she asked, without turning around. "Yesterday morning. Creek we were following dried up." "And food?" Silence. She turned. The stranger's jaw tightened. That was answer enough. Eleanor stood and walked to her kitchen shelf. 3 eggs, half a loaf of bread she'd baked 2 days ago, a jar of preserves she'd been saving for Sunday because Sundays were the only days she still pretended life had a rhythm. She cracked the eggs into her only pan. "Sit down," she said. "Ma'am, I don't need—" "I said sit down." He sat. She cooked in silence. The eggs hissed in the pan. The boy's breathing began to slow on the bed. Not worse, just settling. She watched his chest rise and fall while the eggs turned golden. She put the plate in front of the stranger. Bread, eggs, a spoonful of preserves on the side. He looked at the plate, then at her. "Eat," she said. "You look worse than he does. You just hide it better." Something crossed his face. Not gratitude exactly. Something older, like he'd forgotten what it felt like when someone noticed. He ate, quietly, carefully, like a man who'd been taught manners a long time ago and hadn't forgotten them even when the world stopped watching. Eleanor sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. She didn't eat. There wasn't enough for 3, and she'd already decided that hours ago, before they even arrived, back when she'd counted her supplies and calculated exactly how many days she could stretch them. 4 days. She had 4 days of food left. 5 until the bank came. "What's your name?" she asked. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Carter. The boy's Caleb." "Eleanor Whitfield." "I know," he said, then caught himself. "I mean, the name on the post at the bottom of the ridge. I saw it riding up." She studied him. His hands were rough, but his nails were clean. His boots were worn through at the sole, but the leather was quality, the kind that cost more than her horse. His shirt was sun-bleached, but the stitching was tight, machine-stitched, not homemade. She filed that away and said nothing. "One night," she said, "the boy can rest. You can water your horses at what's left of my well. Come morning, you ride on." "Yes, ma'am." "And you sleep on the floor, by the door, not near the bed." "Yes, ma'am." "I keep a revolver under my pillow. My husband taught me to shoot before he taught me to pray. You understand what I'm saying?" Samuel looked at her, steady, no offense in his eyes, just something that almost looked like respect. "I understand, Mrs. Whitfield." "Miss, he's been dead 2 years. I stopped being Mrs. the day they put him in the ground." Samuel nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that. Sorry was the most useless word in the English language, and she'd heard it enough to last 3 lifetimes. Night came slow in the Colorado summer. The heat didn't break. It just turned from white to amber. Eleanor sat on her porch with the revolver across her lap and watched the valley below. Smoke. Not campfire smoke. Not brush fire. Railroad smoke. The kind that came from engines and money and men who measured land in dollars instead of seasons. She'd seen the surveyors 2 weeks ago. 3 men with instruments and notebooks, hammering stakes into soil that had been farmed for 40 years. They didn't knock on her door. They didn't introduce themselves. They just measured and marked and moved on, like the people living on that land were furniture to be relocated. The banknote was due in 5 days, $47. She had 11. Her husband, Thomas, had borrowed against the land 3 years ago to buy cattle. The cattle died in a winter freeze 6 months later. Thomas died the following spring, not from sickness, not from injury. He just stopped. Stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped waking up one morning, like his body finally agreed with what his heart already knew, that the land had beaten him. Eleanor buried him next to the fence line, where he used to stand every evening watching the sun go down. She paid for the burial with their wedding silver. She kept the ring. $47. She could sell the horse. That might bring 30. But without the horse, she couldn't haul water from the lower creek since her well was going dry. Without water, she couldn't keep the garden. Without the garden, she had nothing to eat come fall. Every choice led to the same place, losing. Inside, she heard the boy cough, then a murmur. Samuel's voice, low and steady, saying something she couldn't make out. Then silence again. She gripped the revolver and stared at the railroad smoke until her eyes burned. Morning. Eleanor woke before dawn out of habit. She'd trained herself to rise in the dark because the dark was when she could think without the land reminding her of everything she'd lost. She found Samuel already outside. He was at her well, and the sound she heard wasn't the empty scrape of the bucket she'd grown used to. It was water. She walked over. He'd dismantled the upper mechanism, parts laid out on a cloth in the dirt, organized, deliberate, like a surgeon's instruments. He was reassembling something in the pipe housing, his hands moving with precision that didn't belong to a drifter. "What are you doing to my well?" "Pump shaft was misaligned. Seal cracked. You've been losing water pressure for months." He didn't look up. Should have been pulling 3 times what you're getting. She watched his hands. Fast. Certain. He knew what he was doing. Not like a man who'd learned by necessity, but like a man who'd studied, who understood the engineering underneath the rust. I didn't ask you to fix it. No, ma'am. He finished. Stood. Cranked the pump handle 3 times. Water poured. Not the thin trickle she'd been surviving on. A real stream, clear and cold, splashing into the bucket and overflowing onto the ground. Eleanor stared at it. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not pain. Something worse. Relief. The kind that reminds you how tired you've been. She turned away before he could see her face. "Caleb's still sleeping," Samuel said. "Fever broke around 3 in the morning. He'll be hungry when he wakes." "I have eggs." "I noticed you didn't eat last night." She stopped walking. Turned. "I wasn't hungry." "You were." Their eyes met. She expected challenge. She found truth. The simple, undecorated kind that doesn't need volume. "Don't presume to know me, Mr. Carter." "Wouldn't dream of it. But I know what hunger looks like on a person who's too proud to show it." She walked inside without answering. She cracked the last 2 eggs into the pan and made them for Caleb. The boy was a miracle she hadn't expected. He woke mid-morning with color back in his cheeks and a smile that split open the silence of the cabin like sunlight through a crack. "Mornin', Miss Ellie." She didn't correct him on the name. No one had called her anything soft in 2 years. Caleb ate like he'd been starving, which he had, and then asked if he could see the chickens. She had 4 left. Scraggly, stubborn hens that laid just enough to keep her alive. "They ain't friendly," she warned. "That's all right. Neither was I before breakfast." She almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught somewhere in her throat and stayed there. But her mouth moved, and Caleb saw it and grinned like he'd won something. He gathered eggs like he'd done it his whole life. Gentle. Talking to the hens in a low voice, calling them by made-up names. Duchess, Cornbread, Mrs. Feathers. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched, and felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Belonging. Not hers. His. The boy belonged here, the way rain belonged on dry ground. Naturally, without explanation, like the land had been waiting for him. She shut that feeling down fast. They were leaving. Today. She'd said one night, and she meant it. But when she walked to the barn to tell Samuel, she found him reinforcing her fence. The south section had been leaning since spring, and she hadn't had the strength to fix it alone. "I said one night," she said. Samuel drove a nail. "You did." "Sun's up. Boys fed. You can ride." He straightened, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Caleb's stronger, but not strong enough for a full day's ride in this heat. One more night, then we're gone." "I can't afford to feed 3 people, Mr. Carter." "I'll hunt. Saw rabbit tracks down by your south pasture. I'll bring back enough for a week." "I don't need your charity." "It ain't charity. It's a trade. I fix what needs fixing. You let the boy rest one more night. Fair deal." She wanted to say no. Every survival instinct she'd sharpened over 2 years of solitude told her to say no. Strangers were risk. Attachment was risk. Hope was the most dangerous thing on the frontier because it made you soft right before the land hit you again. But Caleb was laughing behind her. She could hear him talking to the chickens, his voice carrying across the yard like music from a room she'd locked shut. "One more night," she said. "Then you ride." "Yes, ma'am." Samuel hunted. He came back with 3 rabbits and cleaned them without being asked. He built a fire outside because the cabin was too hot for cooking, and he roasted the meat on a spit made from green branches, the kind that don't burn. He knew things, Small things, practical things, but also things that didn't match the story his worn clothes were telling. Caleb set the table inside. 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 forks, like it was the most natural thing in the world. They ate together. Eleanor couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten with other people. The food tasted different when there were voices around it. Better, fuller, like the same rabbit she could have cooked alone somehow carried more nourishment because a boy was laughing across the table, and his father was quiet in a way that felt like shelter instead of silence. After supper, Caleb asked if she had any books. "One," she said. "Bible, top shelf." "I've read that one. Pa has better books in his saddlebag." She glanced at Samuel. He shifted in his chair. "Boy reads too much," Samuel muttered. Caleb pulled a leather-bound book from the saddlebag by the door. The binding was rich, gold embossed, not the kind of book a drifter carried. Eleanor watched Samuel, watching her notice the book. His jaw tightened, just slightly. A man catching a door before it opened too far. "That's a fine book for a traveling man," she said carefully. "It was his mother's," Samuel said. Quiet. Final. The kind of tone that closes a conversation like a coffin lid. Eleanor nodded. She understood that tone. She used it herself whenever someone mentioned Thomas. Caleb read aloud. His voice was clear, practiced, educated. He pronounced every word correctly and paused in the right places. This was not a ranch boy's reading. This was schooling. Expensive schooling. Eleanor said nothing. She listened. She watched Samuel watching his son read, and she saw in his face the only emotion he seemed unable to hide. Fear. Not of her. Not of the heat or the road or whatever they were running from. Fear of being known. That night, after Caleb fell asleep and Samuel settled on the floor by the door, Eleanor sat at her table with the kerosene lamp turned low and counted her money again. $11. 5 days. She looked at the man sleeping by her door. His hand rested on his son's shoulder, even in sleep, reaching across the distance between the floor and the bed like a bridge he'd built from instinct. "Who are you, Samuel Carter?" She didn't ask it aloud, but the question sat in the cabin like a third person, present, breathing, waiting. Outside, the railroad smoke rose against the stars, and down in the valley, a man named Derek Calloway lit a cigar on the porch of the Ridgeway Hotel and opened a leather folder marked Whitfield Property, Acquisition Pending. He smiled. 5 days was more than enough. Samuel didn't leave the next morning. Eleanor told herself it was because of Caleb. The boy woke with a cough that rattled deep in his chest, and when he tried to stand, his legs folded under him like wet paper. Samuel caught him before he hit the floor and carried him back to bed without a word. Eleanor watched from the stove. She'd already cracked the last egg, not hers, one Caleb had gathered yesterday, and put coffee on to boil with grounds she'd reused twice. "He can't ride," Samuel said. His voice was flat, but his hands were shaking. "I can see that. 2 more days, maybe 3. Then we're gone." Eleanor poured coffee into 2 cups, set one in front of him, kept the other. "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." She sat down, looked at him, really looked. "What are you running from, Mr. Carter?" His fingers tightened around the cup. "What makes you think I'm running?" A man who's traveling goes somewhere. A man who's running goes anywhere. You rode up a ridge with no town, no water, and no reason. That's not traveling. Samuel drank his coffee, slow, buying time the way men do when the truth is sitting right behind their teeth and they're trying to keep their mouths shut. "Everybody's running from something, Miss Whitfield." "That ain't an answer." "No, ma'am, it ain't." He stood, put on his hat, walked outside. Eleanor heard the sound of the axe hitting wood 10 minutes later. She didn't stop him. She needed the wood, and he needed something to hit. Caleb slept through the morning. His fever was low but stubborn, the kind that breaks and comes back and breaks again like it can't decide whether to let go. Eleanor sat beside him and pressed cool rags against his forehead, and somewhere, in the haze of half-sleep, the boy reached for her hand and held it. His fingers were small, warm, trusting in a way that made her chest ache. "Mama?" he whispered. Eleanor's breath caught. She didn't correct him. She just held his hand tighter. "I'm here," she said. "I'm right here." When she looked up, Samuel was standing in the doorway. He'd heard. She could see it in his face, the way his expression broke open for 1 second before he rebuilt it. He turned and went back to the woodpile without speaking. Eleanor sat there holding a dying woman's son and thought about all the ways God takes things from you, and all the strange, cruel ways he sometimes gives them back. By afternoon, Samuel had split enough wood to last her through September. He'd also patched the leak in her barn roof, rehung the gate that had been dragging in the dirt since spring, and sharpened every blade she owned, kitchen knives, the axe, even the old scythe Thomas used to carry to the south field. Eleanor found him at the barn, organizing tools she'd left scattered after Thomas died, because touching them felt like touching a ghost. "You don't have to do all this," she said. "I know. Then why are you?" Samuel set down the wrench he was holding, looked at her straight. "Because your well was broken and you were drinking mud. Because your fence was down and any coyote could walk through. Because your roof had a hole and come fall, the rain would have rotted everything underneath. So? So somebody should have helped you a long time ago, and nobody did." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not because they were kind. She could handle kindness. She'd learned to deflect it like a stone skipping off water. But because they were angry. He wasn't pitying her. He was furious. At something she couldn't see. At whoever should have been here and wasn't. "I managed fine alone," she said. "You survived alone. That ain't the same thing." She turned and walked back to the cabin, because if she stood there one more second, she was going to cry. And Eleanor Whitfield had made a promise to herself 2 years ago that she would never cry in front of another living soul. That evening, Caleb's fever dropped enough for him to sit up and eat. Eleanor made soup from the rabbit Samuel had brought and stretched it with wild onions from the edge of her garden. Caleb ate 2 bowls and asked for a third. "You're going to pop," Eleanor said. "That's all right. I'll pop happy." She gave him the 3rd bowl. Samuel watched her scrape the pot for herself, barely half a serving, and said nothing. But after Caleb fell asleep, she found a cleaned rabbit wrapped in cloth on the porch. Samuel had hunted again, without being asked, without telling her. She brought it inside and put it in the cold box, and stood there in the dark kitchen feeling something she didn't have a name for. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't love. It was the terrifying sensation of a door opening that she'd nailed shut. 3 days passed like that. Samuel worked, Caleb healed. Eleanor cooked and tended and kept her distance and failed at keeping her distance. Because the boy followed her everywhere, to the garden, to the chicken coop, to the well, chattering about everything and nothing, filling the silence she'd built her life around with a noise she was starting to need. "Miss Ellie, why don't you got a dog?" "Dogs eat food I don't have." "What about a cat?" "Had one. She left. Smarter than me, I reckon." Caleb laughed. That laugh again. Clear and whole, like bells ringing in a church she'd stopped attending. "When I grow up," he said, "I'm going to live on a ridge like this, with chickens and a big garden and maybe a dog, and nobody telling me where to be." Eleanor looked at him. "Where do people tell you to be?" The boy's smile flickered, just for a heartbeat. Then it came back, but the light behind it had dimmed. Nowhere. Forget I said that. She didn't forget. She filed it away next to the expensive book and the quality saddles, and Samuel's hands that knew engineering, and the way he flinched every time she asked a direct question about his past. On the fourth morning, Eleanor walked to the well, working perfectly now, pulling cold, clean water like it had never been broken, and saw dust rising on the valley road below. A rider, coming fast, riding a horse too fine for this territory. Tall, groomed, the kind of animal that cost more than her cabin. She didn't go inside for the revolver. She probably should have. But something told her this wasn't a man who used guns. This was a man who used paper. And paper was more dangerous. The rider reached the top of the ridge within the hour. He dismounted with an ease that said he'd been riding since birth, but preferred carriages. Young, maybe 30, clean-shaven, suit pressed despite the dust, hat tilted at an angle that was fashionable in Denver and ridiculous out here. He smiled before he spoke. Eleanor distrusted him immediately. Nobody smiled first on the frontier unless they were selling something. "Good morning, ma'am. Derek Calloway." He removed his hat. "I represent the Western Colorado Land and Rail Company." "I know who you represent. Your men were hammering stakes into my neighbor's field 2 weeks ago." "Progress moves forward, ma'am. Can't stop a river." "Progress didn't ask permission to walk on private ground." Calloway's smile didn't waver. He had the kind of face that practiced its expressions in a mirror. Handsome in a way that was calculated. Warm in a way that was rehearsed. "Miss Whitfield, I'll speak plainly. The railroad expansion has been confirmed. A spur line will run through this valley within 18 months. Every property along the route is being assessed for acquisition. My land ain't for sale." "With respect, ma'am, your land isn't for keeping either. I've spoken with Mr. Harlan at the bank. Your note comes due in— I know when my note comes due. 4 days. $47. And I understand your current resources are limited." Eleanor felt the heat rise in her neck. Not embarrassment. Rage. This man had looked at her ledger, talked to her banker, calculated her desperation like a sum in a column. "What are you offering?" she asked. Not because she wanted to sell, because she wanted to know exactly how little he thought she was worth. $12 an acre, 60 acres, $720. That covers your debt, gives you enough to relocate, and my land is worth 30 an acre at least. In a normal market, perhaps. But the railroad is coming regardless, Miss Whitfield. If you don't sell willingly, the territorial authority can invoke eminent domain. You'll receive even less." That's a threat. That's arithmetic. They stood there, two people on opposite sides of a number. Calloway with his pressed suit and his practiced smile. Eleanor with her patched dress and her father's blood in her veins. The blood of a man who fought the Arapaho, survived 2 winters without shelter, and built this cabin with his own broken hands. "I'll die on this land before I sell it cheap to a man who's never held a shovel," she said. Calloway's smile finally cracked, just a fraction, just enough to show the cold underneath. "That can be arranged too, ma'am. Not by me, of course. But the frontier has a way of solving its own problems." He put his hat back on, turned to his horse, then stopped, because Samuel was standing at the corner of the barn, watching. Calloway's expression changed, not shock, recognition. The kind that hits before the brain catches up, when the body knows something the mouth hasn't said yet. "Well," Calloway said softly, "I'll be damned." Samuel stepped forward, slow. His face was stone. "You're a long way from Cheyenne, Derek." Eleanor's stomach dropped. They knew each other. The way Samuel said the name, no title, no formality, just the flat sound of a man who'd used it many times before, told her everything and nothing at the same time. Calloway recovered fast. That practiced smile slid back into place like a mask being retied. "Samuel! Didn't expect to find you here." His eyes moved to the cabin, to Eleanor, back to Samuel. Something calculated crossed his face. "Last I heard, you'd disappeared. Your father's been looking." "My father can look all he wants. He's not a patient man. I know exactly what kind of man he is." The air between them tightened. Eleanor felt it, the weight of a history she wasn't part of, pulling at the silence like a rope stretched between two cliffs. Calloway tilted his head. "Does she know?" "There's nothing to know." "Samuel," Calloway laughed. Short, sharp, like a dog's bark. "There's everything to know. And you standing here, playing ranch hand on a ridge that my company is about to acquire. That's either the worst luck I've ever seen, or the strangest conscience. Leave her land alone, Derek. That's not your decision. I'm making it my decision." Calloway's eyes narrowed. For the first time, the smile was completely gone. Underneath it was something Eleanor recognized. Ambition. The kind that didn't care who it burned. "Interesting," Calloway said. He looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am, I'd ask your guest about his last name. Might change your perspective on a few things." He mounted his horse, tipped his hat, a gesture that should have been polite, but felt like a threat, and rode down the ridge without looking back. Silence. Eleanor stood in the yard with dust settling on her boots and her heart hammering, and 4 days until she lost everything. She turned to Samuel. "How do you know that man?" "Doesn't matter." "The hell it doesn't. He walked onto my land, threatened my home, and then looked at you like you were a ghost he'd been waiting to bury. How do you know him?" Samuel pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his hair. She could see him calculating. Not the way Calloway calculated, with profit margins and leverage, but the way a man calculates the cost of truth versus the safety of silence. "We worked together. Years ago. Different life." "Worked together how?" "I'd rather not say. And I'd rather not lose my home. But here we are." He looked at her. Something broke in his expression. Not all the way. Samuel Carter didn't break all the way about anything, but enough that she could see the fracture lines, the grief, the guilt, the weight of something he'd been carrying long before he climbed her ridge. "I used to work in rail," he said. "That's all." "What kind of work?" "The kind I'm not proud of." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the scar on his jaw, and the way his pulse beat in his neck, and the slight tremor in his hands that she'd been pretending not to notice for 4 days. "Did you know my land was on the railroad line when you rode up here?" "No." "Did you know Calloway was coming?" "No." "Are you lying to me, Samuel Carter?" He met her eyes, held them. In the space between one breath and the next, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not deception, not calculation, but terror. The raw, unguarded fear of a man who'd found something worth losing and knew he was about to lose it. "I have never lied to you," he said. "But I haven't told you everything." "That's the same thing." "No, ma'am, it ain't. A lie is a door you lock to keep someone out. Silence is a door you lock to keep yourself in." Eleanor stared at him. Her hands were shaking. She balled them into fists at her sides. "You've got until Caleb's well enough to ride. Then I want the truth. All of it. Or you leave and you don't come back." "Yes, ma'am." She turned and walked inside, closed the door, leaned against it and pressed both palms flat against the wood, and breathed. In the bedroom, Caleb was sitting up in bed, holding his leather-bound book against his chest. He'd heard everything. She could see it in his face, that flickering fear she'd glimpsed before, the look of a child who'd watched his world crack open more than once. "Miss Ellie?" "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Are we leaving?" She looked at this boy, this small, brave, trusting boy who called her chickens by name and held her hand in his sleep and laughed like the world hadn't already tried to break him. "Nobody's leaving tonight," she said. Caleb's shoulders dropped. Relief. The desperate kind that children feel when an adult says the thing they need to hear, even if it might not be true. "Can I help with supper?" he asked. "You can set the table." He climbed out of bed, got the plates. 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 forks. The same configuration he'd set every night since he arrived. Like a ritual, like a prayer made of tin and wood. Eleanor watched him and thought, "I am in so much trouble. Not because of the bank, not because of Calloway, not even because of whatever secret Samuel was carrying like a stone in his chest. Because she was starting to love this boy. And love, on the frontier, was the one thing more dangerous than debt. That night, Samuel sat on the porch. Eleanor brought him coffee, even though she told herself she wouldn't. "Calloway will come back," she said. "I know." "He'll bring the bank, or the law, or both." "I know." "And when he does, your silence won't protect anyone. Not me, not Caleb, not yourself." Samuel held the coffee cup in both hands. The steam rose between them like a veil. "My wife's name was Ruth," he said quietly. "She died bringing Caleb into the world. After that, nothing I owned meant anything. The houses, the accounts, the name, all of it felt like a costume I was wearing over a dead man." Eleanor sat down beside him, not close, but closer than before. "So I left," he said. "Took Caleb, rode west. I wanted him to know what dirt feels like, what work feels like, what it means to earn a meal instead of ordering one." "Earn a meal," Eleanor repeated. "That's a strange thing for a rail worker to say." Samuel's jaw tightened. He sipped his coffee. "I wasn't just a worker, Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her first name. It landed between them like a stone dropped in still water, and neither of them acknowledged the ripples. "Then what were you?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked out at the valley where the railroad smoke still smudged the stars. "Ask me again tomorrow," he said. "Please." She should have pushed, should have demanded, should have grabbed that truth by the collar and dragged it into the light. Instead, she sat beside him in the dark and listened to the coyotes sing, and wondered how a man she'd known for 4 days could make her feel less alone than she'd felt in 2 years. Inside, Caleb mumbled in his sleep. Something about chickens. Something about home. And down in the valley, Derek Calloway sat in the telegraph office and composed a message to a man in Cheyenne, whose last name was also Carter. "Found him. Stop. Ridge property, northwest of Ridgeway. Stop. Send authority. Stop. He won't leave willingly. Stop." The telegraph operator clicked the message into the wire. The wire carried it east. And the night carried on like it always does, indifferent to the people trying to survive inside it. The answer came before sunrise. Eleanor heard the horses first. Not 1, not 2. 3 riders coming up the ridge at a pace that said business, not visiting. She rolled out of bed, grabbed the revolver, and was at the window before her eyes fully adjusted to the dark. Samuel was already on the porch, standing, still, like he'd been waiting for this his whole life. "Get inside," Eleanor said through the window. "No. Samuel, take Caleb to the back room. Don't come out until I tell you." She wanted to argue. Every stubborn bone in her body wanted to plant itself in the doorway and fight whatever was coming up that ridge. But Caleb was awake now, sitting up in bed with wide eyes, and the fear on his face was the kind that didn't come from being startled out of sleep. It came from memory. This boy had seen riders come before. "Pa?" Caleb's voice cracked. "Stay with Miss Ellie, son." Eleanor scooped the boy up. He was heavier now. 5 days of food and rest had put weight back on his bones. But she carried him like he weighed nothing, because adrenaline does that, turns a tired woman into something unbreakable when a child needs protecting. She set him on the floor of the back room, the small space where she kept preserves and flour and a trunk of Thomas's clothes she couldn't bring herself to open. "Stay here," she said. "Miss Ellie, don't let them take Pa." She looked at his face, tear-streaked, terrified, and underneath the terror, a resignation that no child should carry. The look of a boy who'd learned that the people he loved could be taken. "Nobody's taking anybody," she said. She went back to the front window. 3 riders had stopped at the edge of her property. Calloway was in the middle, sitting his horse with that practiced ease. To his left, a man in a black coat, thin, spectacled, carrying a leather case. A lawyer. Eleanor could smell them at 50 yards. To Calloway's right, a broad man wearing a deputy's badge, hand resting on his belt like he expected trouble and was almost looking forward to it. Calloway dismounted first. The lawyer followed. The deputy stayed on his horse. "Mornin', Samuel." Calloway's voice carried up the ridge like poison in clean water. "Sleep well?" Samuel didn't answer. He stood on the porch with his hands at his sides, and Eleanor noticed something she hadn't seen before. He wasn't afraid. He was resigned. The way a man stands when he's been running, and his legs finally give out, and he turns to face whatever's been chasing him. "I brought Mr. Aldrich from the Western Colorado Land Company," Calloway continued, gesturing to the spectacled man, "and Deputy Briggs, in case there are any misunderstandings." "There's no misunderstanding," Samuel said. "You're trespassing." "Actually, that's debatable," Calloway smiled. "Considering who you are and where you're standing, one might argue you're the one trespassing. On your own family's future investment." Eleanor pushed through the front door. She couldn't stay inside. She'd rather get shot standing in daylight than cower behind a wall. "This is my property," she said. "State your business or get off my land." Calloway looked at her with something that almost resembled pity. Almost. The cruelty underneath kept it from landing. "Miss Whitfield, my business today isn't primarily with you. It's with Mr. Carter." He turned back to Samuel. "Or should I say, Mr. Carter of Carter Rail and Freight, son and sole heir of Josiah Carter Sr., majority shareholder of the largest railroad enterprise between Cheyenne and Sacramento." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She felt them in her stomach first, then her chest, then behind her eyes where the pressure built so fast she thought her skull might crack. She looked at Samuel. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. He stood there, absorbing Calloway's words like a man absorbing bullets, each one landing, each one doing damage, and none of them enough to knock him down. "That true?" Eleanor's voice came out wrong. Too quiet, too steady. The calm before everything breaks. Samuel turned to her. His eyes were the saddest she'd ever seen on a living person. "Yes." One word. No explanation, no excuse. Just the naked, terrible truth standing between them like a wall that hadn't been there 5 seconds ago. "You're a Carter," she said. "Carter Rail." "Yes." "The railroad that's taking my land." Eleanor, the railroad that's taking my land, Samuel. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted. The mask he'd been wearing, the quiet cowboy, the humble drifter, the man who fixed wells and hunted rabbits and slept on floors, fell away. What was underneath wasn't a stranger. It was the same man, but heavier, older, carrying a name that weighed more than anything she'd ever lifted. "I left that company 3 years ago," he said. "When Ruth died, I signed over operational control to the board. I haven't spoken to my father in 2 years. I haven't taken a dollar from that company in 18 months. "But you still own it," Calloway said, stepping forward. "Controlling shares, 51%. That's not something you walk away from, Samuel. That's not something that disappears because you put on a cowboy hat and pretend to be poor." "I didn't pretend." "You slept on her floor," Calloway laughed. "You ate her food she couldn't afford, while your name sits on a bank account in Cheyenne, worth more than every property in this valley combined. If that's not pretending, I don't know what is." Eleanor's hands were shaking. She gripped the porch railing to stop them. Samuel turned to her, fully, ignoring Calloway, ignoring the lawyer, ignoring the deputy who'd shifted his weight and put a hand on his holster. "I didn't know your land was on the rail line when I rode up here. I swear to God, Eleanor, I didn't know." "But you knew what your company does. You knew they take land." "Yes. And you sat at my table and watched me count $11, and you said nothing." "What could I have said? I'm the son of the man who's going to take your home?" "You would have shot me, and you would have been right to." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes. She refused them. She'd promised herself. Not in front of anyone. Not ever again. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I know." "I trusted you." "I know." "My son trusted you." The word came out before she could stop it. My son. Not the boy. Not Caleb. My son. Like her heart had made a decision her mouth wasn't ready for. Samuel's face crumbled. Just for a second. Just long enough for her to see that her words had reached something deep inside him that Calloway's accusations couldn't touch. "Miss Whitfield," the lawyer spoke up. Aldrich. Thin voice, thin man, thin soul. "I have documentation here requiring Mr. Carter's signature. As majority shareholder, his authorization is needed for the Ridgeway Valley acquisition to proceed. This includes your property." "He ain't signing anything on my porch." "The law doesn't require your porch, ma'am. It requires his signature. And if he refuses—" Aldrich opened his leather case and produced a sheaf of papers. "His father has filed a petition for conservatorship, on grounds that Mr. Carter has abandoned his fiduciary responsibilities and may be mentally unfit to manage his holdings." Eleanor's head snapped toward Samuel. "They're saying you're crazy?" "They're saying whatever gets them what they want," Samuel said. His voice had changed, harder now. The voice of a man who'd sat in boardrooms and courtrooms and knew exactly how these games were played. "Sign the authorization," Calloway said, "and the conservatorship petition goes away. Your father gets his rail line, you get your inheritance. Everybody wins." "Except her," Samuel said. "Except every farmer in this valley." "Progress has costs, Samuel. You used to understand that." "I used to believe a lot of things I'm ashamed of." Calloway stepped closer. His smile was gone now. What remained was the real man. Ambitious, ruthless, calculating. A younger version of Samuel's father, hungry for the approval that came with delivering results. "Let me be clear," Calloway said. "If you don't sign, your father takes control through conservatorship. The acquisition proceeds anyway, and you lose everything. Your shares, your inheritance, your freedom." He'll have you committed to a sanitarium in Denver, if that's what it takes." "He'd do that to his own son?" Eleanor said. "Ma'am, Josiah Carter built an empire. You think he'd let his son dismantle it because of a guilty conscience?" Samuel laughed. It was the worst sound Eleanor had ever heard. Hollow, broken, carrying the weight of a lifetime of knowing exactly who his father was. "He'd do worse," Samuel said. "And he has." "Then sign. Take the money. Disappear again if you want. But stop pretending you can save this valley by hiding on a ridge." Samuel looked at the papers in Aldrich's hand. Eleanor watched his eyes move across the words. Legal language. Binding language. The kind of words that turn people into numbers and homes into assets. Then he looked at Eleanor. "How much is your land worth?" he asked. "Not Calloway. Her." "What?" "Fair value. If there was no railroad, no pressure, no deadline, what's your land worth?" Eleanor swallowed. 30 an acre? Maybe 35 with the water rights Thomas secured. 60 acres. That's $2,100. "Samuel, don't." "Calloway offered you $720. Less than half." Samuel turned to the lawyer. "That's the fair dealing your company practices? Buying land at a third of its value from a widow who can't fight back?" Aldrich shifted uncomfortably. Even lawyers had nerves when the numbers were spoken out loud. "Market conditions," Aldrich began. "Market conditions you created," Samuel cut him off. "You move surveyors in, panic the sellers, depress the prices, buy cheap. Then the rail line triples the value, and you sell parcels back at a premium. I know the model, Aldrich. I helped design it." Silence. Eleanor stared at him. He helped design it. The very machine that was grinding her into the dirt. He'd helped build it. "That was before," Samuel said, reading her face. "Before Ruth. Before Caleb. Before I understood what those numbers meant to the people underneath them." "How noble," Calloway sneered. "The rich man finds his conscience after his wife dies. Save it for church, Samuel." "Watch your mouth," Eleanor snapped. The words came out before she thought about them, and she was as surprised as anyone. Defending him, after what she'd just learned, after the betrayal, the lies, the omission that felt worse than a lie. She was still standing between him and the wolves. Because she'd seen his hands shake when Caleb was sick. She'd seen him sleep on a floor and eat last and work without being asked. She'd seen the way he looked at his son. Like Caleb was the only real thing left in a world made of paper and smoke. A man who loves like that isn't the same man who built that machine. He isn't. He can't be. "I'm not signing," Samuel said. Calloway's face hardened. "Then your father takes control. Conservatorship. Lawyers. Courts. You'll be in Denver by next week and in a cell by the end of the month." "Maybe." "Definitely." "Then that's the price." "The price of what?" Samuel looked at Eleanor, held her gaze, and in that look was everything he couldn't say with Calloway standing there. Every apology, every confession, every unspoken promise that he would burn his own life to the ground before he let her lose hers. "The price of doing right," he said. Calloway shook his head. "You're a fool." "Probably." "Your father will destroy you." "He's been trying for 30 years. I'm still here." Calloway turned to the deputy. "Briggs, Mr. Aldrich needs to serve those conservatorship papers. Mr. Carter is to be escorted to Ridgeway to await transport to Denver." The deputy dismounted, slow, heavy. He walked toward the porch with the deliberate stride of a man following orders he hadn't questioned. "Samuel Carter, The deputy's voice was flat. You've been instructed by a railroad lawyer to remove a man from private property that isn't yours, isn't his, and isn't the railroad's, Eleanor said. She stepped in front of Samuel. The revolver was inside, but she didn't need it. Her voice was enough. This is my land. I haven't sold it. The banknote isn't due for 3 more days, and until that note comes due, every person standing on this ridge who isn't me is here by my invitation or not at all. The deputy hesitated. He looked at Calloway. Calloway nodded. Ma'am, I have legal authority to. You have a badge from a territorial office that answers to a governor who answers to voters. Half those voters are farmers in this valley. You want to drag a man off a widow's property in broad daylight because a railroad company told you to? Go ahead. See how that plays in the next election. Briggs stopped. His hand dropped from his belt. He was calculating, not money, but consequences. The kind that followed a man home and sat at his dinner table. Derek, the deputy said slowly, maybe we ought to handle this different. Calloway's composure cracked. A flash of something ugly. Frustration, rage, the tantrum of a man who'd expected easy and gotten hard. Fine, Calloway said. 3 days. When her banknote comes due and she can't pay, the property enters default. The railroad files acquisition. And you, Samuel, you'll either sign or your father's lawyers will bury you. He mounted his horse. Aldrich scrambled after him, stuffing papers back into his case. The deputy followed, slower, glancing back at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't read. Respect, maybe, or guilt, or both. They rode down the ridge. Dust and silence closed behind them. Eleanor stood on the porch until they disappeared. Then her legs gave out. She grabbed the railing and sank to the boards and pressed her forehead against the wood and breathed. Samuel knelt beside her. "Don't touch me," she said. He pulled back. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. Sorry doesn't pay my banknote. Sorry doesn't undo what your family built. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you sat in my house and let me feed you my last eggs while your name is on the deed to everything that's killing me." "You're right." "I know I'm right. Don't agree with me like it helps." She lifted her head, looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She'd kept her promise, no tears. But the pain behind them was worse than any tear could carry. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you stay? After the first night? After Caleb was better?" "You could have told me the truth and ridden off and I never would have known." Samuel sat on the porch beside her, not touching, not close, but there. "Because the first morning, when you gave Caleb your last food and didn't eat yourself, you looked at him the way Ruth used to, like he mattered more than breathing. And I thought, if there's one honest person left in this territory, she's on this ridge. And she deserves better than what my family is about to do to her." "So you stayed to protect me?" "I stayed because you were the first real thing I'd seen in 3 years. And I wasn't ready to leave that." Eleanor pressed her palms against the porch boards, felt the grain, the splinters, the realness of something built by hands instead of lawyers. "Caleb's in the back room," she said. "He's scared to death." Samuel stood, started for the door. "Samuel." He stopped. "After you talk to your son, you and I are going to sit at that table, and you're going to tell me everything. Every share, every dollar, every piece of this machine you helped build. Because if we've got 3 days, we're not spending them being sorry. We're spending them figuring out how to fight." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not hope exactly, but the first cousin of hope, the thing that comes right before it. "You said we," he said. "Don't read into it. I need your brain, not your heart." She stood, brushed off her dress, walked inside. Caleb was sitting in the back room, exactly where she'd left him, clutching the leather-bound book against his chest. "Miss Ellie?" he whispered. "Did they take him?" She knelt down, took his face in both hands, looked into the eyes of a boy who'd been running his whole life because his grandfather wanted an empire more than a grandson. "Your pa's right outside. Nobody took him. Nobody's going to." Caleb's lip trembled. "He said that before. In Cheyenne. Then they came." "This isn't Cheyenne. This is my ridge. And on my ridge, I decide who stays and who goes." The boy threw his arms around her neck, held on with a strength that didn't match his size, the kind of strength that comes from terror, from love, from the desperate grip of a child who's learned that the world takes people away and is begging it not to, just this once. Eleanor held him back, pressed her cheek against his hair, felt his heartbeat hammering against her chest like a bird trapped inside a room. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you." That night, Samuel talked. He sat at Eleanor's table with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands, and he told her everything. His father, the company, the expansion model that bought land cheap from desperate people and sold it back at 10 times the price, the political connections that made eminent domain a rubber stamp, the lawyers who buried complaints, the money that silenced opponents. He told her about Ruth, a teacher's daughter from Ohio, who married him despite his name and loved him despite his wealth, and died in a farmhouse outside Cheyenne because the doctor was 20 miles away and the roads were washed out, and all the money in the world couldn't buy 10 more minutes. He told her about the morning after Ruth's funeral, when his father walked into the nursery where Samuel was holding newborn Caleb and said, "You've had your grief. The board meets Thursday. Be there." And Samuel looked at his 3-day-old son and looked at his father and said, "No." That was the last word he'd spoken to Josiah Carter. Eleanor listened to all of it, every word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't comfort. She sat across from him and absorbed his truth, the way the ground absorbs rain. Slowly, completely, letting it sink into places that hadn't been reached in a long time. When he finished, she poured fresh coffee for both of them. "Your shares," she said, 51%. What happens if you sell them?" "Can't sell. Father put a restriction in the corporate charter. Shares transfer only through inheritance or board vote." "What about relinquishing? Just giving them up?" Samuel paused. "Technically, I could transfer controlling interest to minority shareholders. It would dilute my father's influence. The board would fracture." "And the rail line?" "Without majority authorization, the Ridgeway expansion stalls. The board would have to vote on every acquisition individually. Takes months, maybe years." "And your father?" "Loses control. Of the company, of me, of everything he built." "What does that cost you?" Samuel looked at her. "Everything. Inheritance, name, every dollar I've ever been connected to. Caleb's future, at least the future my father planned for him." "What about the future Caleb wants?" Samuel's eyes filled. He blinked it away, but she'd already seen it. The raw, terrible love of a father who'd sacrifice a fortune for his son's freedom, and was terrified it still wouldn't be enough. "He wants chickens," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "He wants a ridge, and a garden, and a dog, and somebody who calls him sweetheart when he walks through the door." Eleanor's throat tightened. She took a slow breath. "Then give him that. It means we'll have nothing. You'll have him. You'll have yourself. And those are the only two things Calloway can't put a price on. Samuel stared at the table. His hands were flat on the wood. She watched his fingers, the same fingers that had fixed her well, split her wood, held his son. And she watched them curl into fists and then slowly, deliberately, open. "I'll need paper," he said, "and a witness. Old Jeremiah Pike lives 4 miles south. He can witness. You know a man who rides at night? Jeremiah Pike doesn't sleep. Hasn't slept since the war, or so he claims." Samuel almost smiled. Not quite. But the corner of his mouth moved, and his eyes softened, and for 1 second he looked like the man she'd glimpsed underneath all the armor. The one who carried his son to a stranger's door and said, "Please." "Eleanor." "What?" "Thank you for not shooting me when you had the chance." She stood, took his empty cup, walked to the sink. "Night's not over yet, Mr. Carter." She didn't turn around, but she was almost smiling too. Almost. The kind of almost that means more than a full smile, because it's fighting through something real to get there. Outside, the ridge was quiet. No horses, no lawyers, no deputy with a conflicted conscience. Just the heat and the dark, and 3 people in a cabin made of wood and stubbornness, and whatever this fragile, unnamed thing was that had grown between a widow with nothing and a millionaire who wanted nothing, and a boy who only wanted home. 3 days, $47. And one decision that would burn an empire to the ground. Old Jeremiah Pike rode up the ridge before dawn with a face like cracked leather and a shotgun across his saddle that looked older than the territory itself. Eleanor met him at the gate. She hadn't slept, hadn't tried. She'd spent the night at the table with Samuel, going over every detail of the Carter Rail Charter. Every clause, every loophole his dead wife's lawyer had once explained to him in a parlor in Cheyenne while Ruth nursed baby Caleb in the next room. "You look like hell, girl," Jeremiah said, swinging down from his mule. He was 73 years old, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from Shiloh, and had the kind of voice that sounded like it had been dragged over gravel and set on fire. "Your message said urgent. My bones say I'm too old for urgent." "I need a witness." "For what?" "A legal transfer of corporate shares." Jeremiah squinted at her, then past her to Samuel standing in the doorway. "Who's he?" "That's the man signing. He look like he can afford corporate shares?" "More than you'd think." Jeremiah tied his mule and walked toward the porch with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who'd survived enough wars to know that hurrying gets people killed. "Mister," he said to Samuel, "I don't know you, and I don't care to, but Eleanor Whitfield is the only neighbor I got who brings me bread when the snow gets deep. So if this paper you're signing does anything to hurt her, I'll put a hole in you so wide they'll bury you in 2 coffins." Samuel nodded. "Fair enough." "Good. Where do I sign?" They gathered at the table. Samuel had spent the night writing in a hand that was precise, educated, and angry. The penmanship of a man who'd been trained by tutors and was now using that training to dismantle everything those tutors had prepared him for. The document was simple. Samuel Boone Carter, majority shareholder of Carter Rail and Freight, hereby transferred his 51% controlling interest to be divided equally among the 7 minority board members, effective immediately. No conditions, no reversions, no golden parachute. A clean, complete severance. Eleanor read it twice, not because she doubted Samuel, because she needed to understand exactly what he was giving up. Everything. That was the answer. Everything his father had built. Everything his name had meant. Every door that would have opened for Caleb, every safety net, every inheritance. Gone. With a signature and 2 witnesses. "You're sure?" she said. Samuel looked at her. "I've never been more sure of anything since the day I picked up my son and walked out of my father's house." "Your father will fight this." "My father will lose. The charter allows voluntary transfer. He wrote that clause himself. Never imagined his own son would use it against him." And Callaway? Without majority authorization, the Ridgway acquisition stalls. Every property in this valley stays with its owner until a full board vote. That takes 6 months minimum. By then, the minority members will have their own agendas. The expansion dies. Eleanor looked at the paper, then at Samuel, then at Caleb, who was sitting on the bed watching with his leather-bound book in his lap and his eyes wide and old and understanding too much for a boy his age. "Caleb," she said, "you understand what your pa is doing?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand what it means?" The boy looked at his father, a long look, the kind that carries a conversation without words. "It means we're free," Caleb said. Samuel's jaw tightened. He picked up the pen, dipped it in the ink Eleanor had found in Thomas's trunk, dried, reconstituted with water, still dark enough to mark a page. He signed. Jeremiah signed as witness. Eleanor signed as second witness. Samuel set the pen down and stared at his signature like a man watching his old self die on paper. "It's done," he said. "Not yet," Eleanor said. "That paper needs to reach the territorial clerk in Ridgway before Callaway files his acquisition. And it needs to reach the board in Cheyenne before your father's conservatorship goes through." "I'll ride to town myself." "No," Eleanor shook her head. "Callaway has eyes on this ridge. The moment you ride down, he'll have Briggs intercept you. That paper never makes it to the clerk's office." "Then how?" Eleanor turned to Jeremiah. The old man was already grinning, 2 teeth missing on the left side, 1 on the right, and a smile that said he'd been waiting 73 years for someone to ask him to do something worth doing. "Jeremiah, you still know the back trail through Miller's Canyon?" "Know it. I carved half of it with a Bowie knife in '52. "Can you get to Ridgway without using the Valley Road?" "Girl, I can get to Ridgway without touching dirt if I have to." Eleanor took the signed document, folded it carefully, and placed it in an oilskin pouch Thomas had used for carrying deeds. "Territorial Clerk's Office. Judge Whitaker if the clerk's not in. File it before noon." Jeremiah took the pouch, tucked it inside his coat, looked at Samuel. "You're giving up a fortune, son." "I'm giving up a cage." Jeremiah nodded, slowly. The nod of a man who'd lost 2 fingers, a brother, and 40 years of sleep to wars fought by rich men and bled by poor ones. "I'll be there before the office opens," he said. He walked out, mounted his mule, rode into the darkness without looking back. Eleanor stood at the door and watched him disappear. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "If Callaway finds out before Jeremiah files—" "He won't," Samuel said. "You don't know that." "I know Jeremiah Pike. Men like him don't get caught. They're too stubborn and too mean." Eleanor almost laughed. She caught it, held it, let it sit in her chest like a warm coal. Then she turned to face the one thing she'd been avoiding all night. "Your banknote," Samuel said. He'd read her mind. Or maybe he'd just been waiting for her to arrive at the same number he'd been staring at for hours. "Don't. Eleanor, if you tell me you paid my debt, I swear to God—" "I paid your debt." She stopped breathing. 3 days ago, before Callaway came the first time. I rode to Ridgway at night while you and Caleb were sleeping. Found the bank, left $47 with Mr. Harlan in a sealed envelope. Anonymous. No name. "You had $47? "I had $47. A millionaire carrying exactly $47. I had more, in a belt sewn into my saddle lining. Emergency money. Ruth made me promise to always carry enough to survive 6 months. His voice cracked on her name, barely, like a hairline fracture in stone. I used most of it getting Caleb and me from Cheyenne to here. The 47 was almost the last of it. Eleanor leaned against the doorframe. Her legs were doing that thing again, threatening to quit, threatening to fold, threatening to drop her right here in front of this man who'd given away a fortune at her table and paid her debt with his dead wife's emergency money. "You had no right," she whispered. "I know." "That was my debt, my problem, my decision." "I know." "And you rode down there in the dark and paid it like it was nothing?" "It wasn't nothing. It was everything I had left." She stared at him. The anger and the gratitude were so tangled inside her, she couldn't separate them. Couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to thank him. She wanted to sit down on the floor and cry for the first time in 2 years, because someone, this impossible, infuriating, broken, beautiful man, had seen her drowning and thrown her a rope made from his last shred of dignity. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," she said. "You haven't looked in a mirror lately." She pressed her lips together, hard, holding everything in. The laugh, the sob, the scream, the prayer. All of it pushed against her teeth like water against a dam. "Don't ever make a decision about my life again without asking me first," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I mean it, Samuel." "I know you do." She walked past him into the cabin, sat down at the table, put her head in her hands. Caleb climbed off the bed and padded over in bare feet. He stood beside her chair and put his small hand on her shoulder. "Miss Ellie, are you all right?" She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "I'm all right, sweetheart." "Pa made you mad." "Your pa makes me a lot of things." "He does that." Caleb paused. Then, with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "But he always means well, even when he's dumb about it." Eleanor lifted her head, looked at the boy, his mother's eyes, his father's jaw, and something entirely his own, a grace, a kindness, a willingness to love people despite their flaws that must have come from God, because it certainly didn't come from the Carter bloodline. "Yeah," she said, "he does." The morning passed in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full. Full of things said and unsaid. Full of decisions that couldn't be undone. Full of 3 people sitting in a cabin on a ridge, waiting for the world to catch up with what they'd already set in motion. Noon came, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Eleanor paced. Samuel sat. Caleb read his book, turning pages with steady fingers while the adults around him vibrated with tension. At 2:30, dust rose on the valley road, not from the south, from the north, the Ridgeway direction. Eleanor grabbed the revolver. Samuel stood. Caleb closed his book. The rider came fast, faster than Calloway, faster than any lawyer or deputy. This was a rider in a hurry. Not the hurry of business, but the hurry of someone carrying news that burns. It was Jeremiah. He pulled his mule to a stop that nearly threw him over the animal's head. The old man was grinning so wide, Eleanor could count every missing tooth. "Filed," he said. "Recorded. Stamped. Judge Whitaker himself. Said it was the most interesting document he'd seen in 20 years of territorial law." Eleanor's knees buckled. She caught herself on the porch post. "Calloway?" Samuel asked. "Came in 20 minutes after me. Red-faced and sweating like a pig in August. tried to file the acquisition papers. Whitaker told him the controlling interest had been transferred, said the acquisition couldn't proceed without a full board vote under the new ownership structure. What did Calloway do? Jeremiah's grin widened. Son, I ain't seen a man turn that particular shade of purple since General Grant ran out of whiskey at Vicksburg. He screamed. He threatened. He pounded that clerk's desk so hard he cracked the inkwell. Whitaker told him if he didn't leave the courthouse in 30 seconds, he'd spend the night in the Ridgeway jail. And the conservatorship? Whitaker reviewed it. Said it was filed under false pretenses. You clearly ain't crazy, just stupid in love. And he's recommending dismissal to the territorial court. Samuel sat down on the porch steps. He put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. Not crying exactly, something deeper than crying. The release of a man who'd been holding his breath for 3 years and finally let it go. Caleb ran to him, threw his arms around his father's neck. Samuel pulled him close and held him with both arms and rocked him gently. And Caleb buried his face in his father's chest and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Eleanor watched them from the doorway. The revolver hung at her side, heavy and useless. She didn't need it anymore. Hadn't needed it since the moment a tall cowboy knocked on her door and said please. Jeremiah cleared his throat. One more thing, the old man said. His voice had changed. Quieter now, less triumphant. The voice of a man delivering the second half of a message he'd been saving. Calloway left the courthouse, but he didn't ride south. He rode to the telegraph office, sent a wire to Cheyenne. Samuel lifted his head. He's telling your father, Jeremiah said. Everything. The transfer, the woman, the boy, all of it. The air on the ridge went still. How long before he gets here? Eleanor asked. Josiah Carter? Jeremiah shifted his weight. Man like that, with a private rail car and enough money to buy a locomotive? 3 days, maybe 2. Then we have 2 days. To do what? Eleanor straightened. She looked at Samuel, at Caleb, at the old man on his mule who'd ridden through the dark to file a paper that would change everything. To get ready, she said. Jeremiah laughed, that gravel and gunpowder laugh she'd known since she was a girl, back when her father was alive, and the ridge was full, and the world hadn't started shrinking. Ready for what, girl? Josiah Carter doesn't negotiate. He doesn't compromise. He buys, he takes, he destroys. And when he can't do any of those things, he gets personal. He'll come for the boy. Caleb's grip on his father tightened. Eleanor saw it, the way the child's fingers dug into Samuel's shirt, the way his whole body went rigid with a fear that came from experience, from memory, from knowing exactly what his grandfather was capable of. He can come, Eleanor said. But he'll come to my door, and on my land I decide who walks in. You're one woman with a revolver. I'm one woman with a revolver, a paid-off banknote, a legally filed transfer document, and the stubbornest man in Colorado sitting on my porch. I've fought with less. Jeremiah looked at her for a long time. Then he shook his head with something that might have been admiration. Your daddy would be proud, Eleanor. My daddy would have shot Calloway the first time he smiled. That too. Jeremiah rode down the ridge, slower this time. The urgency was gone, but something else had taken its place. The steady, purposeful pace of a man who knew the fight wasn't over and was saving his strength. Eleanor turned to Samuel. He was still sitting on the steps, Caleb in his lap. Both of them looking up at her with expressions so similar it made her chest ache. The Carter eyes, dark and deep, but without the Carter greed. Just gratitude. Just exhaustion. Just the raw, honest gaze of two people who'd stopped running and didn't know what came next. Come inside, she said. "Both of you. There's soup on the stove." "Eleanor." "What?" Samuel stood, set Caleb down gently, took one step toward her, just one, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the scar on his jaw and the way his pulse hammered in his neck. "I need to say something." "If it's another apology—" "It's not." She waited. "When I knocked on your door 6 days ago, I was a man with no name and no home and a son I was failing. I had $47 and a guilty conscience and nothing else. You gave us water. You gave us food. You gave Caleb something he hasn't had since his mother died. A woman's voice telling him it's going to be all right." "Samuel." "I don't have a company anymore. I don't have an inheritance. I don't have a name worth anything except the weight of it. But I have my hands, and I have my word, and if you'll let me, I'd like to stay. Not for one more night, not as a trade, just stay." Eleanor felt the dam crack. Not break, she wouldn't let it break, but crack. Enough for one thin stream of everything she'd held back for 2 years to slip through. "You're asking to stay on my ridge." "I'm asking to earn the right to be here." "I don't need a man to save me, Samuel Carter." "I know. I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to be the kind of man who deserves to stand next to you." Caleb was watching from the porch, holding his book, his eyes moving between them like a boy watching the most important conversation of his life, and knowing it, and being brave enough to stay quiet and let it happen. Eleanor looked at this man, this stupid, noble, broken, rich-turned-poor man who'd given away a railroad empire and paid her debt with his dead wife's emergency fund, and slept on her floor for a week without complaint. "You can stay," she said, "but you sleep on the floor until I say different." "Yes, ma'am." "And you eat last." "I always do." "And if your father shows up at my door, you stand behind me, not in front, behind. This is my land and my fight, and I'll be the one who faces him." Samuel looked at her, a long, steady, quiet look that carried more than words could hold. "Yes, ma'am." She turned, walked inside, got the soup. Caleb set the table, 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 forks. Same as every night, same as always. But tonight, when he set them down, he paused, looked at the 3 settings, and smiled. "Feels right," he said softly. "To nobody. To everybody." Eleanor ladled soup and pretended she didn't hear, but her hands were shaking again. Not from fear this time, from something worse, something better. From the terrifying, uncontrollable, impossible feeling of a life rebuilding itself around a table set for 3. Outside, the telegraph wire between Ridgeway and Cheyenne hummed with a message that would bring a storm. And Josiah Carter, sitting in his private rail car with a glass of bourbon and a face carved from stone, read Calloway's wire and crushed it in his fist. His son had chosen dirt over dynasty, a widow over wealth, a ridge over a railroad. The old man stood, called for his porter, ordered the car attached to the next westbound train. He'd built an empire with his bare hands. No one, not a judge, not a widow, not even his own blood, would tear it down. He was coming, and he was bringing everything. Josiah Carter arrived on the 2nd day, not the 3rd, not with warning, not with the courtesy of a telegram announcing his approach. He came the way empires come, early, overwhelming, and without asking permission. Eleanor heard the convoy before she saw it. Not horses, wheels. A carriage, the kind that didn't belong within 50 miles of Ridgeway, pulled by 4 matched black horses, flanked by 2 riders in dusters who carried rifles across their laps like they'd been paid enough to use them. She was at the well when the sound reached her. She set the bucket down, dried her hands on her dress, walked to the porch, and picked up the revolver. Samuel came out of the barn. He'd been repairing a harness. Unnecessary work. Busy work. The kind of work a man does when his hands need something to hold, because otherwise they'll shake. He saw the carriage and stopped moving. "Pa?" Caleb appeared in the doorway. His face had gone white. Not the white of illness, the white of recognition. The boy knew that carriage. He'd ridden in it. He'd been afraid of it before he could spell his own name. "Go inside, Caleb," Samuel said. "No." The boy stepped onto the porch, his small jaw set in a way that was pure Carter stubbornness, the one trait that had finally found its right purpose. "I'm staying." Samuel looked at Eleanor. She looked back. Neither of them told the boy to move. The carriage stopped at the gate. One of the riders dismounted and opened the door. A man stepped out. Josiah Carter was 71 years old, and he looked like he'd been carved from the same iron he'd used to build his railroad. Tall, straight-backed, white hair cropped short under a hat that cost more than Eleanor's cabin. His suit was black. His boots were polished. His eyes were the same dark brown as Samuel's, but where Samuel's held grief, Josiah's held calculation. Every glance was an appraisal. Every breath was a business decision. Behind him, Calloway climbed out of the carriage, smiling again. The faithful dog returning with his master. And behind Calloway, a third man. Short, round, carrying 2 leather cases. Another lawyer, because one hadn't been enough. Josiah walked through the gate without waiting for invitation. He crossed Eleanor's yard with the stride of a man who'd never been on land he didn't consider his own. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and looked at his son. Silence. The kind of silence that has a pulse, that has teeth. "Samuel," Josiah said. One word, his son's name. But the way he said it, flat, hard, with the precision of a hammer hitting a nail, turned it into something else entirely. An accusation, a summons, a wound. "Father, you look like a vagrant. You look like a man who rode 2 days to say something he could have put in a letter." Josiah's mouth twitched. Not a smile, the ghost of one. The kind that visits faces trained never to show weakness. Letters can be ignored. I cannot. He turned to Eleanor. Looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's considering purchasing. Assessing value, calculating cost, determining whether it's worth the space it occupies. "You're the widow," he said. "I'm the owner of this land, and you're standing on it without invitation." Josiah's eyebrow raised, 1 fraction of an inch. "I'm standing on dirt, ma'am. Dirt my company surveyed, my investors financed, and my railroad was going to build through. Until my son apparently lost his mind and gave away his birthright to impress a woman. He didn't do it to impress me. Then why did he do it? Because it was right." Josiah laughed, short, sharp, cold. The same laugh Calloway used, and Eleanor realized where the younger man had learned it. "Right." Josiah repeated the word like it tasted foreign. "My son gave up 51% of a $30 million enterprise because it was right. Do you know what that money could build, ma'am? Hospitals, schools, cities, entire futures. It could also take farms from widows and land from families who've worked it for generations," Eleanor said. "But I suppose that doesn't make the brochure." Something flickered in Josiah's eyes. Not anger exactly. Surprise. the surprise of a man who didn't expect resistance from someone he'd already dismissed. He turned back to Samuel. "I'm here to offer you one chance. One. Come home. The board hasn't ratified the transfer yet. It requires a formal vote at the next quarterly meeting. Until then, you can rescind. Take back your shares. Resume your position. Caleb gets his inheritance. You get your life. This episode gets forgotten." "It's not an episode, Father. It's a choice. It's a tantrum, the same kind Ruth used to indulge in you." Samuel's whole body went rigid. Eleanor saw it. The way his spine locked, the way his hands curled at his sides, the way the muscle in his jaw jumped like a wire pulled taut. "Don't say her name," Samuel said. His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes either walking away or throwing a punch. "She filled your head with this nonsense, conscience, simplicity, living off the land like some frontier fantasy. She was a schoolteacher's daughter with romantic ideas and no understanding of what it takes to—" "I said, don't say her name." The air cracked. Not with volume. Samuel hadn't raised his voice, but with force. The force of a man who'd endured 3 years of grief and guilt and running, and had found, at last, the one line he would not let anyone cross. Josiah paused, recalculated, changed tactics the way a general redirects troops, smoothly, without admitting the first approach had failed. "Caleb," Josiah said, turning to the boy. His voice softened, not warmth, an imitation of warmth, the kind that's practiced in boardrooms when investors need reassuring. "Come here, son." Caleb didn't move. "Caleb, I'm your grandfather. I've come a long way to see you." "I know who you are," Caleb said. His voice trembled, but his feet stayed planted on the porch boards. "I remember the last time you came to see me. You told Pa he was wasting your legacy. You told him Mama died because God punishes weakness. I was 3 years old, and I remember every word." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor looked at Josiah Carter and watched something happen that she suspected hadn't happened in 50 years. The old man flinched. Just barely. Just enough for her to see the hairline crack in the iron. "I was grieving," Josiah said, quieter now. "We all say things." "You weren't grieving," Samuel said. "You were angry. You were angry because Ruth's death was inconvenient, because it disrupted your timeline, because you'd planned for me to be at the board meeting the week she died, and I wasn't there, and the Denver contract went to Union Pacific instead. That's what you lost when Ruth died, Father. Not a daughter-in-law. A business advantage." Josiah's face hardened. The crack sealed. The iron returned. "I built this company from nothing, from a single rail spur in Nebraska and a loan I couldn't afford. Everything you have, everything you had, came from my hands. And you threw it away. For what? A broken well and a chicken coop?" "For my son's soul," Samuel said. "Which is worth more than every rail you've ever laid." "Souls don't pay bills. And bills don't hold your hand when you're dying." Josiah went still. For the first time since he'd stepped out of that carriage, the old man looked his age. Not fragile. Josiah Carter would never be fragile. But tired. Tired in a way that money couldn't fix and power couldn't hide. "I'm not dying," he said. "We're all dying, Father. The question is what we leave behind." "I'm leaving behind a railroad." "And who's going to remember you rode it?" The question hung in the air. Calloway shifted uncomfortably behind his employer. The lawyer clutched his cases tighter. Even the hired riders looked away, finding sudden interest in their saddle horns. Josiah turned to Eleanor. How much? Excuse me? Everything has a price, ma'am. Your land, your silence, your willingness to let my son go. Name it. Eleanor felt the anger rise so fast it nearly choked her. Not hot anger, cold. The kind that turns a woman's voice into a blade. You think I'm keeping him here? I think you've calculated the value of having a Carter on your property. Then you're as blind as you are rich. Eleanor stepped off the porch, walked toward Josiah Carter until she was close enough to see the broken blood vessels in his nose and the yellowing at the edges of his eyes. Bourbon and years, and the slow decay of a man who'd preserved everything except himself. Your son walked up to my door carrying a child who was dying of heat sickness. He didn't give me his name. He didn't flash his money. He slept on my floor and fixed my well and hunted rabbits and split wood until his hands bled. He did more for this land in 6 days than your entire railroad company has done for this valley in 6 years. Sentiment! He paid my banknote with his last $47. Not his company's money. His. The emergency fund his dead wife made him carry. He gave up everything he had. Not everything you gave him. Everything he had. To make sure a woman he'd known for 3 days didn't lose her home. Josiah's jaw tightened. That's not a man who lost his mind, Mr. Carter. That's a man who found it. Josiah stared at her, long, hard. The stare of a man who builds empires and breaks opponents, and has never, not once in 71 years, been spoken to like this by someone who had nothing to lose. Calloway, Josiah said without breaking eye contact with Eleanor. The papers. The lawyer stepped forward, opened his case, produced a stack of documents thick enough to choke a horse. Petition for emergency conservatorship, Calloway announced. Filed with a territorial court this morning. Grounds. Samuel Carter has demonstrated irrational financial behavior inconsistent with... Judge Whitaker dismissed that petition yesterday, Eleanor said. We refiled. In Denver. Different jurisdiction, different judge. One who understands the significance of a $30 million estate being thrown away on a whim. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She looked at Samuel. He'd gone pale. They can't do that, she said. They can do whatever they can afford to do, Samuel said quietly. And they can afford everything. Josiah stepped forward. For the first time, he addressed his son not with anger, but with something worse. Patience. The patience of a predator who knows the prey is cornered. Samuel, I don't want to take your freedom. I don't want to put you in an institution. I want you to come home. Bring the boy. Resume your responsibilities. In 5 years, when you've rebuilt what you've damaged, I'll step aside. The company will be yours, completely, on your terms. Your terms, Samuel said. It's always your terms. My terms built the West. Your terms destroyed it. History will decide that. History is written by the people who survive, Father, not the people who profit. Josiah's patience cracked. The anger underneath surged, red-faced, controlled, but visible. The anger of a man who built his life on obedience and couldn't comprehend its absence. If you refuse, Josiah said, the Denver court will grant conservatorship within the week. You will be escorted to Cheyenne. Caleb will be placed in my custody. And this woman's land, dismissed petition or not, will be acquired through eminent domain before the first frost. Caleb made a sound, small, wounded, the sound of a child hearing his worst fear spoken aloud by the one person powerful enough to make it real. Eleanor reached behind her without looking, found Caleb's hand, held it. You take a boy from his father, she said. Your own grandson. I'd give a boy his future. A future he doesn't want. Children don't know what they want. This one does. Eleanor squeezed Caleb's hand. Tell your grandfather what you want, Caleb. The boy stepped forward, small, shaking, but forward. The bravest step Eleanor had ever seen a human being take. I want to stay here, Caleb said. I want to feed the chickens in the morning and read books at night and help Miss Ellie in the garden and watch Pa fix things. I don't want a railroad. I don't want a big house. I don't want people being nice to me because of my name. Josiah looked at his grandson. Really looked. Maybe for the first time. I want to be a person, Caleb said. Not a Carter, just a person. The old man's face did something Eleanor didn't expect. It moved. Not much, not dramatically, but the iron shifted. The mask slipped. And underneath, for one breath, maybe two, she saw something human. Something old and buried and covered with 50 years of ambition and grief and the terrible loneliness of a man who'd built everything and held nothing. Then it was gone. The mask returned. The iron set. Calloway, Josiah said. File the Denver papers. We're done here. No, said a voice from the gate. Everyone turned. Old Jeremiah Pike stood at the property line. He wasn't alone. Behind him, on foot, on horseback, in wagons, stood a crowd. 30 people, 40, farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers from every corner of the valley. Men in work clothes and women in plain dresses and children perched on fence rails. They filled the road up the ridge like a river that had changed course. Jeremiah walked forward. In his hand he carried a paper, not a legal document, a petition, signatures, dozens of them, scrawled in pencil and ink and what looked like charcoal, by hands that worked earth and leather and iron, hands that had never held a corporate share, but had built every standing structure in the valley. Petition to the territorial governor of Colorado, Jeremiah said, his gravel voice carrying across the ridge. Signed by every landowner in Ridgeway Valley, requesting formal investigation into predatory land acquisition practices by Carter Rail and Freight, requesting injunction against all eminent domain proceedings pending review, requesting, and this is the part I like best, a public audit of every transaction Derek Calloway conducted on behalf of said company. Calloway's face drained of color. You can't, he started. Already done, Jeremiah said. Filed with the territorial office this morning. Copy sent to the Denver Post. Copy sent to the governor's personal secretary, who happens to be my nephew's wife's cousin, and who happens to owe me a favor from a card game in '68 that I've been saving for exactly this kind of occasion. Josiah turned to Calloway. The look he gave the younger man could have melted steel. You told me this valley was secured, Josiah said. It was. You told me the landowners were isolated and compliant. They were. They are standing on this ridge, Derek, 40 of them, with a petition and a newspaper contact. Josiah's voice dropped to a whisper that was louder than any shout. You failed. Calloway opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish pulled from water, gasping, flailing, watching the world he'd built on smooth talk and pressure dissolve in front of him. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, middle-aged, strong hands, eyes that had stared down drought and debt and everything the frontier could throw at a person. My name is Clara Jennings, she said. I own the farm at the bottom of Miller's Creek. Your man Calloway offered me $8 an acre for land my husband died working. $8 for 40 years of blood. Another voice, a man, older, leaning on a cane. "Henry Bosch, South Ridge. Calloway told me if I didn't sell, the railroad would condemn my property. I've got the letter, signed by him." Another, and another, and another. Voices rising from the crowd like stones being laid, one at a time, each one solid, each one adding to a wall that Josiah Carter's money couldn't buy or break. Eleanor stood on her porch and listened, and felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died, since her father died, since the last time she'd believed that people could stand together instead of falling apart. Community. The word she'd forgotten. The thing the frontier was supposed to destroy but kept refusing to die. Josiah Carter listened to every voice. His face was stone. His hands were clasped behind his back. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He stood in Eleanor Whitfield's yard and heard the testimony of people his company had tried to erase. And when the last voice fell silent, he stood there a moment longer. Then he turned to his son. Father and son looked at each other across 10 feet of dirt and 30 years of damage. "You did this," Josiah said. "No," Samuel said. "She did." He looked at Eleanor. "They did." He looked at the crowd. "I just got out of the way." Josiah was quiet for a long time. The hired riders shifted in their saddles. The lawyer clutched his cases. Calloway stared at the ground. "You'll have nothing," Josiah said to Samuel. "I'll have enough. Your mother would be ashamed. My mother would be standing on this porch." That landed. Eleanor saw it. The old man's shoulders moved. Not a flinch this time, but something deeper. A settling. The weight of a truth he'd spent decades avoiding. Josiah looked at Caleb. The boy was still holding Eleanor's hand, still standing on the porch of a cabin that cost less than Josiah's hat, still choosing this. "Boy," Josiah said. His voice was different now, stripped of performance, raw in a way that made Eleanor realize she was hearing the real Josiah Carter for the first time. Not the empire builder, not the railroad king, but the old man underneath. "Do you know what you're giving up?" "Yes, sir." "And you choose this?" Caleb looked at Eleanor, at Samuel, at the chickens scratching in the yard, and the well that pumped clean water, and the ridge that caught the morning light. "I already chose it," Caleb said, "the day she opened the door." Josiah Carter stood very still. The crowd watched. The valley held its breath. Then the old man reached into his coat and pulled out the conservatorship papers. He held them in both hands, looked at them, looked at his son, looked at the boy holding a widow's hand on a porch made of pine. He tore the papers in half, then in half again. He let the pieces fall. "Calloway," he said without turning around, "you're fired." "Mr. Carter, get off this woman's land before I let the old man with the shotgun do what he's clearly been wanting to do since he got here." Jeremiah grinned and cocked the hammer. Calloway nearly tripped over the lawyer getting to the carriage. Josiah watched them scramble. Then he turned back to Samuel. "I won't apologize," the old man said. "I don't know how. Your mother was the one who knew how to do that, and I buried that knowledge with her." "I know, Father." "But I won't come for the boy, and I won't come for your shares. Whatever you've done, it's done." Samuel nodded. His eyes were bright. Not tears. He was a Carter. They didn't cry in public. But brightness. The kind that comes from pressure releasing so fast the body doesn't know whether to laugh or collapse. Josiah turned to Eleanor. For one moment, one breath, the iron was completely gone. What stood in front of her was an old man in an expensive suit who'd built a railroad and lost a family and didn't know how to find his way back. "Take care of my grandson, ma'am." "I will. He deserves better than what I gave his father." "Then let him have it." Josiah nodded, put on his hat, turned and walked to his carriage with the same straight-back stride he'd arrived with, but slower now, heavier, carrying something he hadn't brought with him. The first small, terrible seed of understanding that an empire built on taking was worth less than a cabin built on giving. The carriage rolled down the ridge. The crowd parted to let it pass. Nobody spoke. Nobody jeered. They watched in silence, the way people watch a storm break, with relief, with exhaustion, with the quiet knowledge that they'd survived something they weren't supposed to. Jeremiah rode up to the porch, uncocked his shotgun, looked at Eleanor. "Well," he said, "that was something." "Jeremiah." "Yeah?" "Thank you." The old man tipped his hat. "Your daddy would have done the same for me. That's how it works out here. Always has been." He rode down to join the others. One by one, the valley people turned and headed home. Some nodded at Eleanor as they passed. Some touched their hats. Clara Jennings stopped and squeezed Eleanor's hand without saying a word, and that single gesture carried more meaning than any speech could hold. When the last person had gone, the ridge was quiet again. Eleanor sat on the porch steps. Samuel sat beside her. Caleb sat between them, his legs dangling, his leather-bound book in his lap, his head leaning against Eleanor's arm. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Caleb said, "Miss Ellie?" "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Can I call you something else?" Her breath caught. She looked at Samuel. He was watching his son with those dark Carter eyes, the eyes that had been full of fear for 3 years and were now, finally, full of something else. "You can call me whatever you want, Caleb." The boy thought about it, seriously, the way children think about things that matter, with their whole body, their whole heart, their whole small and enormous soul. "Ma?" he said. "Can I call you Ma?" Eleanor Whitfield, who had buried a husband, fought a railroad, faced down an empire, and refused to cry for 2 years, felt the dam break. The tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and warm and real, running down her face and falling onto the boy's hair as she pulled him against her chest and held him. "Yeah," she whispered. "You can call me Ma." Samuel put his arm around them both. Not asking, not announcing, just reaching. The way a man reaches for the thing he's been running toward without knowing it. The thing that was waiting at the end of every empty road and every sleepless night, and every mile between Cheyenne and this ridge. Family. Not built by blood, not bought by money, not inherited from a dynasty. Chosen. Earned. Held together by well water and rabbit soup, and a boy who named chickens, and a woman who opened her door when everything in the world told her not to. 2 weeks later, Samuel built a bench beside the front door. He carved it from pine he'd cut on the south ridge, and he sanded it until the wood was smooth enough for a child to sit on without splinters. Caleb painted the address post at the bottom of the ridge. New letters. Careful. Proud. Whitfield Carter. Eleanor didn't ask him to add the second name. She didn't need to. The boy had already decided. They married on a Tuesday morning in September, standing in the garden with Jeremiah Pike as witness and 4 chickens as audience. No priest. Jeremiah read from the Bible and skipped the parts he disagreed with, which was most of it. No rings. Samuel slid Thomas's ring off Eleanor's finger, kissed it, and put it back. And she understood that he wasn't replacing anything. He was honoring what came before. Caleb held both their hands during the vows. Afterward, Eleanor stood at the edge of the ridge and looked down at the valley. No railroad smoke, no surveyors, no men with instruments measuring the worth of things that couldn't be measured. Just land, just people, just the ordinary, stubborn, beautiful work of living. Samuel came up behind her, stood close, not touching, because he'd learned that Eleanor Whitfield came to you on her own terms or not at all, and the waiting was part of the love. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the valley, at the cabin, at the boy chasing chickens in the yard with a laugh that could crack open the sky. "I'm thinking I opened my door to a stranger and got a family." "Regrets?" "You still sleep on the floor half the time." "Only when I snore," "which is every night." He laughed. She leaned against him. His arm came around her shoulders. Warm, steady, real. Down in the yard, Caleb caught a chicken and held it up triumphantly. "Ma, I got Duchess!" "Don't squeeze her, Caleb." "She likes it." "She does not." The boy laughed. The chicken squawked. Samuel shook his head. Eleanor pressed her face against his shoulder and smiled. And the ridge held them all, the way good land does, the way it always has, quietly, stubbornly, without asking for anything in return except the one thing worth giving: a life lived honest, a door kept open, a family chosen not by name, but by heart. Money builds railroads, but love builds homes. And the richest man alive is the one brave enough to walk away from everything, and wise enough to know that everything was never worth as much as this.